Thank you for that. Can you hear me okay? Thank you all for being here. And thank you to the organizers of this great event. It's really good for people coming from different parts of the left to come together and have some discourse and focus on some of the things that I think we all share in common, which is the spirit of this controversial talk I'm going to give. America's not a hub for red diaper babies. Most people on the American left come to that position. They're not thrown into it at birth. Coming to the left as Americans usually requires what philosophers call an event, an often traumatizing rupture of our everydayness. We are navigating through our normal life, and something happens that breaks that routine, that forces us to think. It is an experience that grips us, keeps us up at night, chipping at it as we try to make sense of what it was. The philosopher Alain Badiou says that it is in these events that truth hits us. What we are forced to tarry isn't just a chaotic and contingent predicament. It is the rupture of the symbolic order of everyday life. It shows us the impossible real, the truth, which everydayness attempts to hide and obscure from sight. This reality always presents itself as impossible precisely because it cannot be made sense of within the coordinate system of our dominant understanding, even though it is the conditions for the possibility of it. It shatters even the basic categories through which we have come to make sense of the world, the categories that condition our subjectivity, our desires, our fantasies, and even our aesthetic appreciation. It forces us to reckon with the fact that the world we live in is constituted through such an impossibility, that it is that which presents itself as an external obstacle which, in reality, constitutes what it is an obstacle for. Everyone has these events occur at various moments of their life. Most people try to evade their significance, to distort and force their meaning back into the very coordinate system it shattered. This is how most people cope with it. Their worldviews never actually recover, though. They remain as fractured as Simon Berger's broken glass art. Historically, leftists are the people who accept that something has happened and who have fidelity to the process of figuring out exactly what has occurred. This is often a frightening process, considering that what is implied in it is a loss of self, of your old self, which is understood in light of the pre-event predicament. It requires courage to pursue the significance of the event, to inquire into the truth it reveals. All of us know that such a quest will only lead to a rebirth of the self, a spiritual baptism. For me, this occurred around the age of 10. My mother had just given birth to my sister. The birth caused tremendous difficulties, and my dad was asked that question which no father ever wants to be asked. If it comes to worst, which one do you like us to save? Thankfully, both survived. But in the aftermath of this traumatic event, we discovered that my mother had been growing internal tumors. The doctor said that she must be operated on to guarantee survival. The option seemed obvious: get the operation and guarantee survival, or roll on with it. I was perplexed to find out at this youthful age that the options were not as simple as I thought. Operating came with a cost, a great financial strain on the family, which would have surely led to crippling medical debts like so many Americans face today. While 10 years old, I still found it odd that having a life-saving procedure in the wealthiest country on earth could immerse you in unpayable debt, as if one had committed some sort of heinous crime. Little did I know it would get much more confusing. With such a predicament on the table, my parents did what most families would: consult their friends and family for advice. I remember listening into the conversations in our old home. Maybe 20 or so people in the house, all of us Cuban, by the way. This was when the real event occurred. When consulted for their advice, our friends and family said something I simply could not understand. It was outside of the cognitive map my young self had. The friends and family told my mother that she should go to Cuba, that the operation there would be free. How could it be, I thought, that the same people who I only ever heard malign Cuba maligned socialism, maligned the Cuban government, while simultaneously accepting the most fervently American exceptionalist ideas and narrative, how could they sit here with a straight face and tell this hardworking woman to leave the wealthiest country on earth, a country she's a citizen in, to get an operation in a dirt-poor island, an island they've only ever described as authoritarian and catastrophic? You can see, my friends, why such a predicament was world-shattering for me. All of the assumptions I held about Cuba, about the US, about the values that aligned with both were up in the air. I didn't become the communist I am today, right then and there, but the seeds of doubt of the narratives I held as true and the values I considered superior were planted. It was in 2015 when I began to find answers for this enigma. The campaign of Bernie Sanders was central for me. Here was this adorable old man explaining lucidly the role of profits in our healthcare system and how different it was in other advanced countries. I came to understand that the experience I had at 10 years old was rooted in the fact that we have a system that puts profit over people, and that Cuba, irrespective of whatever its limitations were, had one that puts people over profit. On this basis, I was able to remap myself in the world, to develop new categories through which to engage in everyday life. And most importantly, to develop a new sense of purpose, tied to a new system of values that could give my life meaning. While the failure of the Sanders political revolution, as it was called, brought an end to my alignment with social democratic politics, the politics that had politicized me, it left me with a bug to fight for social justice that I could not shake. This might sound silly, but I knew very early on that my life's purpose was tied to sacrificing whatever necessary to fight for change. I'm sure that just like I have my story, all of you in this room have many stories of what brought you here, what traumatic break in your everydayness caused you to consider yourself as a part of the left, as a part of those committed to moving history forward, those whose agency is tied to ensuring that the arc of history, as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. used to say, continues to bend toward justice. It is in this light, on the basis of this recognition of the fundamental unity we all have, as people who came to realize at different points, in different ways, and for different reasons, that something fundamentally has to change in America, that I would like to propose some ideas from my recent book, Why We Need American Marxism, where the title of this talk was taken from. I felt the need to write this book shortly after a trip to Mexico, where I gave a conference on my previous book, The Purity Fetish and the Crisis of Western Marxism. In that book, I had argued that the US left had to overcome its incessant obsession with only supporting or working with those entities which they considered pure, that is, which they felt lived up to the ideal they had in their head. With this framework, I critically interrogated three forms I thought were most harmful for the American left. First was the outright condemnation of what's often called actually existing socialism. I felt that such a rejection was premised on the fact that these real states were not living up to what they considered to be the ideal of what they thought socialism should be like in their heads. This was a completely faulty approach, since it starts with an abstract ideal and not with reality itself, which I considered Marxists should always have as their starting point. Instead, I argued that we must remember the difficult conditions socialism is forced to develop in, conditions of siege, as Michael Parenti would say. No socialist project has ever been allowed to develop peacefully without hybrid war waged on it by US imperialism and its proxies. Whatever imperfections and contradictions these states might have, they must be understood in this context. They must also be understood not as reified entities existing the same across time, but dialectically, that is, in a constant process of contradiction-ridden development. As Samir Amin used to say, we cannot blame states like China for not looking like the socialism of the year 3000, when the Jonas Brothers say we will be living underwater. That's a millennial joke that did not land. I knew it wouldn't, but I still wanted to say it. In any case, this was a position I considered to be rooted in an American exceptionalism, since it says that the whole global South has failed at socialism, but we, the virtuous Americans, are the ones that are going to succeed. The second form of the purity fetish that I explored in that book was rooted in the attitude I saw many leftists taking to a part of the working class specifically the part that supported MAGA. While hardly ever saying it explicitly, many accepted the Clinton categorization of them as a basket of deplorables. I was one of them before I moved to Iowa and then Southern Illinois for around 10 years as I worked on my bachelor's, master's, and then doctoral degrees. But in the MAGA heartland, I very soon realized that the conception I had of them was a caricature, that some of these people have a righteous anger toward the system, the deep state, as they call it, and a general mistrust of all established institutions. It is on that basis that dissidence starts. And such a pool of workers were primed, in my view at least, for organizing for socialism. The task was, in my view, one of delinking them from Trump and showing them that America could only ever be great if it is socialist, that the stuff they like in Trump, the rhetoric of being anti-war, the rhetoric of being in favor of reindustrialization, of being against the so-called deep state, which he himself is a part of, will never be realized under Trump or the two-party duopoly. The left's condemnation of them, I felt, was rooted in a caricature of who they are, crafted by the hegemonic liberal media. But nonetheless, even if they were as problematic as the media said they were, the task of communists and socialists had always been to organize people not on the basis of the ideas they already hold, because if not, we're just preaching to the choir at that point, but on the basis of their objective class position. Condemning a large chunk of the working class because they don't share the more liberal and cosmopolitan social values that many leftists have, in my view, was archetypical of the purity fetish. They were not deemed pure enough, and hence considered not organizable. This was not a mentality, I felt, that was in line with the history of how dissidents to the capitalist system have organized. And to be clear, when I say MAGA, I'm speaking here about the working class neighbors and co-workers that we all have, not the deep state monsters at the head of the movement who have fooled our brothers and sisters into thinking they are actually political outsiders. The last form of the purity fetish I felt was harming the American left was rooted in what Georgy Dimitrov called national nihilism. For those that don't know, Georgy Dimitrov was a great Hungarian anti-fascist communist leader of the Communist International in the years that the struggle against fascism was most heightened. National nihilism was rooted for Dimitrov in an attitude that wholeheartedly condemned one's national past because of its evils and imperfections. Dimitrov argued that socialism was a content that needed to be given a national form. This was a position that was standard for the 20th century communist movement. It was rooted in the recognition that socialists around the world needed to position themselves as those who will actualize the most progressive elements of the national traditions of their country's people, of the traditions their people already identify with. He urged Americans not to give up figures like Washington and Lincoln to the right, to utilize them for the purposes of the left, showing our countrymen and women that the values of the 1776 revolution, that the conception of government of, by, and for the people cannot be fully actualized under capitalist dictatorships like those which we exist in, and that only socialism can make real the democratic dreams of the American experiment, the dreams that our people already accept. This perspective felt so foreign to how most on the American left conceived of the US. Many of the leftists I was seeing would write America with 3 Ks, burn the American flag, or describe socialism as a process of destroying America itself. I consider this to be not only factually incorrect, since for me America had a rich history of struggle not reducible to genocide, slavery, and imperialism, but also politically futile. How are you going to organize the American people on the basis of telling them they want to abolish all the traditions they have been socialized in, to destroy all the symbols and values they have grown up with? To my surprise, this last form of the purity fetish was the one that perplexed the audience in Mexico the most. I remember some comrades from the Che Guevara Center in Cuba who were in the audience coming up to me and asking me how could leftists reject the revolutionary heroes from 1776 onwards when people from across the global south, from Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam to Mao Zedong in China to Lenin to Fidel and Che themselves, were tremendously inspired by the revolution against the British, and then against the revolution against the planter class in the US South. They told me, and this was something I was already aware of, that even in his defense after the assault on the Moncada barracks, his famous "History Will Absolve Me" speech, Fidel was citing the right to revolution present in the American Declaration of Independence. And thus, after such engagements, I decided to write a book which teased out a bit further the third form of the purity fetish, and which charted a course for overcoming it. Marx and Engels had already written in the Manifesto of the Communist Party that although not in substance but in form, the working class struggle against capitalists is national. This quote has been completely misread by the national nihilist left. They treat form and content in the traditional philosophical medium, where the goal is to pierce through the form, which is treated as a distortion of sorts, to arrive at what is truly important, the content. But this whole understanding of form and content is critiqued by both Marxism and Hegel, where the essence of Marxist philosophy can be found. For these traditions of dialectical thought, form was not simply a distortion of the content, it is the particular manner through which the content manifests itself. The goal is not to pierce through the form to get to the content, but to understand, as Marx says of the commodity, the secret of the form itself. That is, why did the content need to take this specific form? So when Marx and Engels talk about the struggle being national in form, this doesn't mean, as most leftists interpret it today, that it is only superficially national, or that it is in reality not national in something else, something deeper. Instead, for Marx and Engels, as well as for the traditional communist movement of the 20th century, socialism needed to take on a national form primarily because it was the social context it was in, that of the modern nation state, in which the class struggle was being developed. This becomes even more the case when imperialism develops, and wars of national liberation aiming to achieve sovereignty from imperialism are shown as one of the central forms the class struggle takes in the age of imperialism. To understand that every socialist country has had to give the content of socialism a particular national form, and hence treating it as what in philosophy we call a concrete universal. And then to say that we cannot do this because America is uniquely evil, is to participate in the utmost form of American exceptionalism. It is to say that everyone can root their socialism in their national context, but we, the uniquely evil Americans, will not. We will have the pure content of socialism devoid of national form. But to remember this important lesson about socialism taking a national form is not enough. After all, the book is titled Why We Need American Marxism, not Why We Need American Socialism, even though we need that too. I posed the following question at the beginning of my text. If socialism must take on a national form, then does Marxist analysis need to take on a national form as well? That is, do we need something like American Marxism, which understands the specific and particular form the history of the class struggle in our country has taken? The answer I provide in the book is, of course, yes. Basing myself on the research I've done in Chinese, Latin American, and other socialist experiments, I found that what was conjoined with a unique path to the development of socialism was also a unique framework of Marxism that could account for the particular differences in histories and traditions, all of which shape and are shaped by the class struggle. In Cuba, Marxism was integrated as the most advanced stage of their leading revolutionary thinkers, Martí especially. In Bolivia, Marxism is combined with the unique conditions of indigenous communities and with the historical insights which have arisen from such communal realities. In China, they have developed from very early on something called Sinified Marxism, which includes not only explicitly Marxist thinkers in China's history, but also the progressive thinkers from its pre-Marxist past, and also, and here's perhaps the most controversial part, the most progressive aspects of thinkers which have been central to its civilizational reality, thinkers like Confucius, who were not, on the whole, progressive. In Venezuela, the same is true with the figure of Bolivar and others. In each case, what I found was that the rational kernel of these world historic individuals are captured and integrated into the framework of the national form their Marxism takes. In the US, therefore, how would this look? While I don't seek to get into the nitty-gritty here, I do that in the book, I think it is clear that American Marxism needs to integrate into its understanding of the specific class struggles in the US, not just the Marxists of our past, but also the traditions that have stood on the side of progress in American history, starting perhaps even before 1776 itself and going up to our current day. We can start, for instance, with the many First Nation tribes, like the Iroquois, which were existing under what scholars call primary communism. The American anthropologist Lewis Henry Morgan, who was extremely influential for Marx and Engels, if you've heard of a book called The Origins of the Family, Private Property, and the State from Engels, that book is based on the notes that Engels had from Marx, which were based themselves on ethnological notebooks rooted in his study of primarily Lewis Henry Morgan. He would describe what the Iroquois had, whom he lived with, as communism in living. Their influence would go on beyond just the First Nations. As historian Mitchell K. Jones has argued, by the 18th century, their primary communist system inspired settlers from Europe who came to the New World seeking refuge from religious persecution. Or we can perhaps turn to thinkers like Roger Williams, the mid-17th century theologian who rejected African slavery and the genocide of the indigenous on the basis of his Christianity, which he felt compelled us to accept all as equal and dignified under God's eyes. It also forces us to tarry with 1776 as a progressive event in world history, a revolution against the British Empire, the first anti-colonial revolution in the hemisphere, as Herbert Aptheker, one of the most notable progressive historians of the 20th century, called it. This revolution was described by none other than Vladimir Lenin in the following terms, I quote, "It was one of those great, really liberating, really revolutionary wars of which there have been so few compared to the vast number of wars of conquest. That was the war the American people waged against the British robbers who oppressed America and held her in colonial slavery," end quote. The Declaration of Independence was such a radical document for its time that teachers all across Europe could be barred from their post for teaching it. This was a country born out of a call of people to have not only the right, but the duty to overthrow oppressive conditions. It is not lost on history the great paradox of the country which was founded on the right to revolution turning into the empire that prevented and squashed others trying to exert that right for themselves. But nonetheless, the spirit of the Democratic Creed of 1776 provides fertile ground for development into a socialist sentiment. Jefferson himself distinguished between the democratic and the aristocratic man. The democratic man is the man of the people. He is the man of the revolution. The aristocratic man is the man who prioritizes profit, wealth, and privilege. Such a man, Jefferson argued, could be fatal to the implementation of the ideals of the revolution if they come to power. Historical hindsight has shown how correct he was. Many of these figures, perhaps excluding Thomas Paine, are not free of their own contradictions. The opposite, in fact, is true. They could say the most liberating words, push forth the most emancipatory ideals, while in practice being the worst forms of oppressors themselves. This is, of course, the case with Jefferson, Washington, and others. But the ideals that they developed, or better yet, the form that they developed in and how they reached people, cannot be lost sight of. Very few people know what I'm about to tell you. But attempts at developing scientific socialism, basically what would later be called Marxism, were already underway in the mid-1820s in America, 2 decades before any prominent writings from Marx and Engels. In figures like Langdon, Bilsby, Cornelius Blatchley, William McClure, Thomas Skidmore, and many others, the utopian experiments in communism that arose all across the United States were studied and critiqued. All of these thinkers held that a socialist society, which they conceived of as the society that expanded the Democratic Creed of 1776 to the sphere of economics and social life, that a socialist society could only arise by going through capitalism, not by trying to step out of it, as the utopian communities hoped. Through their scientific studies of the political economy of capitalism at the time, these thinkers held that on the basis of the very contradictions of the system itself, a new communist society was possible. While, of course, none of them outlined this with the clarity and refinement that we find in Marx and Engels decades after, how absurd is it that Americans were trying to develop scientific socialism well before Marx, and none of us know who they are? There are perhaps 2 or 3 people, besides myself, who I know have written about these individuals. Isn't this a sad state of affairs? How absurd is it that today we hear socialism being spoken of as uniquely anti-American, both by the right wing and the national nihilist left, when we have such an advanced but yet ignored and forgotten homegrown tradition of socialism? Even the 2 main philosophical currents that arise out of America, transcendentalism and pragmatism, have been leftist in orientation, thoroughly critical of capitalism. The Harvard scholar F.O. Matthiessen described the founder of transcendentalism, Ralph Waldo Emerson, as, quote, and an ancestor of American communism. It is also well known that other transcendentalists like Henry David Thoreau frequently wrote for the New York Daily Tribune, the same leftist paper that Marx and Engels were publishing articles in at the time. The leftist historian Stoughton Lynd, who recently passed, in his Origins of American Radicalism book, takes a few pages to cite both Marx and Thoreau, and forces the reader to guess who was who. The critiques of capitalist alienation in each is virtually impossible to tell apart when put together. This also works if you take quotes from Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations or from the Bible and you compare it to Marx quotes, which I often do with my students, and ask them which one is which. American pragmatism, on the other hand, has always stood on the side of socialism, a homegrown variety of it. Charles Sanders Peirce developed a logic that was intimately social, critical of capitalist individualism, which he considered to be based in the gospel of greed, and promotive of agapism, a communal form of Christian love, upon which he felt society and the quest for truth should be based. The two other major pragmatists were also on the left. William James identified with socialist anarchism and was also one of the founders of the Anti-Imperialist League. And John Dewey considered himself a democratic socialist, one far more radical than those who call themselves today, considering that he participated in real movements to create a third party outside of what he saw as the two major capitalist parties, a third party that unified the working class socialist and radical liberal sectors of the American political horizon. In this way, John Dewey, who is literally called America's philosopher of democracy, is far, far to the left of someone like Bernie Sanders, which is considered the utmost left point in the acceptable American political spectrum today. Few people's thought have shaped contemporary America more than Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the head of the civil rights political revolution of the 1960s. Dr. King, as is well known now, was a socialist. For him, the question of racism, war, and poverty were intertwined and rooted in the capitalist system itself. I can go on and on showing how some of the most prominent and influential thinkers in America's past have been socialists or general critics of capitalism. In general, I would like to make the bold claim that all Americans are already socialist. They just do not know it yet. You can't tell me that someone believes in government of, by, and for the people, and that they don't at the same time believe in socialism. At its most basic level, this is precisely what socialism is. As Fred Hampton used to call it, it is the people. That's why if you're afraid of socialism, you're afraid of yourself. In this way, much of the lingering anti-communism our compatriots have is nothing more than an unrecognized form of self-estrangement. They have been convinced to hate that which they already agree with, just because they do not know that they agree with it yet. There was a dream Trotsky, who I'm not generally a fan of, wrote about in his memoirs, where Lenin visited him well after Lenin had died, and in the dream the conversation gets to a point where Trotsky almost blurts out, "And that was shortly after you had died." He omitted saying it out of fear that Lenin was alive in his dream only because he didn't know that he had already died. Almost like in cartoons, the cat, when he runs off the roof, continues to float only because they don't yet know that they're not on the roof, that they're floating in midair. Likewise, most Americans are anti-communist only because they don't yet know that they're already communist. To propose the development of an American Marxism, then, is to uphold the historical recapturing of the progressive elements of our past. It is to give voice to the unique form the class struggle has taken in our country's history, and how that struggle has been thought of by the most progressive minds of their time. It is to give historical legs to those of us fighting for a new world today. Our fight is for the future, but it is also for the past. It is a struggle which prevents previous struggles from having died in vain. The most important thinker to have given expression in Marxist terms to the unique form the class struggle takes in the U.S. was W.E.B. Du Bois, which I call the father of American Marxism. He was the first to see that, for most of U.S. history, the struggle against the color line, against the racism which Marx called the secret through which the capitalist class sustains its power, that this struggle was not just a race struggle, that it was the form the class struggle took. And no event in this struggle is more significant than the Civil War, which he saw as the Second American Revolution, an event he equated in significance to both the Bolshevik and the Chinese Revolution. He argued that 4 million enslaved proletarians, he also calls them the black proletariat, freed themselves from the chains of chattel slavery through a general strike that won the war. By fleeing from the South to the North, the black proletariat effectively waged a strike against the Southern economy, which produced a dual blow when they joined the North as workers, spies, and soldiers who knew the terrain better than anyone. This is a sharp contrast with how we're taught about the Civil War today, which usually goes something along the lines of the South was winning at first because General Lee was a great general, and then at some point something happens and the North ends up winning. Well, what happens? I don't know, maybe it's the general strike that Du Bois was talking about. We often hear the phrase that it is the victors who write history. The exception, of course, is the Civil War, because the history books that were written about it came from Columbia and from scholars who were primarily sympathetic to the U.S. South. It's one of the only cases in all of human history that I can point to where it was the losers who actually wrote the history of the event. Out of this struggle arose the period of Reconstruction, which Du Bois categorizes as a dictatorship of the working class. Here, the Freedmen's Bureau, which you can see a plaque over there of, I think, would govern in southern states, backed by the military might of the North. This was an experiment, then, in modern socialism, which is never talked about in such terms, nor celebrated anywhere near as much as the Paris Commune, which occurred years after and which lasted a tenth of the time that Reconstruction did. I like the Paris Commune, but ours came first and lasted more. It should be celebrated, I think, at least as much as the Paris Commune. This was a socialism not inspired from abroad, but imminently arising from within the soil of the country's foundation. As Du Bois said, there was no truer believers in the spirit of 1776 and the black proletariat that freed itself in the Civil War and which led a dictatorship of the working class for a decade in the U.S. South before the counter-revolution of property in 1876 would overthrow it. With such a Du Boisian or American Marxist understanding in mind, isn't it silly to talk about how essentially anti-socialist or anti-communist America is? At a time when less than 20% of Americans think their representatives actually represent them, and when less than a dozen% of Americans trust the mainstream media, that being, of course, the dominant ideological apparatus of the ruling capitalist class, we find ourselves in the midst of what I call a comprehensive crisis of legitimacy. Neoliberalism has hit American workers hard, forcing most people to live paycheck to paycheck, to be drowning in unpayable debts, and to be living in a life of utter desperation. We are the first generation of Americans to not be guaranteed a better living standard than our parents. For most of us, fighting is not even an option, it is a necessity. As a Marxist, I think half of the fun in trying to understand the world is ruined if we don't try to change it. Developing an advanced American Marxism, in my view, is essential. We need to know how the class struggle has brought us here and how we can utilize the progressive elements embedded in our people's common sense to move them towards socialism. But this requires a lot more than writing a book or theoretically trying to make sense of something. It requires getting your hands dirty with actual work. It requires building an organized collective of disciplined individuals who can put the struggle, the principle we all operate under, above petty self-interest. It requires turning people from the shallow and hedonistic individualism our society promotes to tried and true communist. You don't do this through debates. You don't do this through nice words and sophistic discourse. You win people through actions, through consistent deeds. Americans will come to recognize socialism as a real alternative when they see the communists are the ones that are the most upstanding people in their workplace and in their communities. We need to try our best to be the men and women of the future society we are striving towards, to lead by example in work, to win the trust and sympathy of our people by serving them. After all, once again, what is socialism if not putting the interests of working people, the masses, as the highest principle in society? This is what my party, the American Communist Party, fights for. All around the country, the cadre of the ACP are doing works of community service to integrate themselves into pre-existing American communities, to show them what communists are actually like, and debunk the myths our people have been spoon-fed about communism. All around the country, our cadre are organizing workers, helping workers unionize, and joining in on picket lines with them. In New Jersey, we have spearheaded the effort of organizing tens of thousands of drayage truckers. These are essential workers, workers who can shut down a whole regional economy that are being organized into the Teamsters by the American Communist Party. This is work we are doing in virtually every state, helping unorganized workers combine and win a voice for themselves. Work of this kind is going on in many other industries around the country, where our party's cadre are helping to lead unionization efforts. And out of these deeds, of course, many of the workers themselves join the party. After every natural disaster, when the local and federal government fails communities, our party has been there. With what little resources we have, it has helped people. The work we are doing in Central Texas after the horrendous floods that have occurred, that work we're doing has impacted the lives of many Americans who were left behind by a government that is always ready to spend money for war, but never for American communities. It is high time that we put whatever secondary or tertiary difference aside, just for a second, and focus on the fact that our people are getting squeezed to the last pennies by a class that continues to grow richer and richer. A class whose puppets are sending us to war around the world to die or lose limbs fighting against people whom we have more in common with than the parasites who sent us there. To paraphrase MLK, the bombs being thrown in Gaza land in Chicago. The empire feeds off of the republic, as Michael Parenti used to say. You can either sit on the sidelines and let things get worse, all because you won't fight for an organization over mean tweets one or another member posted before the party's founding, or you can decide to join us. Judge us through our work, through our deeds, and be a part of fighting for the construction of a new socialist America. I hope you choose the latter. Thank you. All right, any questions?
I have a question. What kind of service work do you guys do in Illinois?
Well, we have the executive of the Illinois chapter here, David, who's somewhere around. He's over there. He's right next to you, actually. You want to answer that, David?
Yeah, sure. Currently, we're working on a lot of social investigation at this point, but we're continually showing up at parks. The parks love us because we consistently show up for their volunteer efforts. We help to reinvigorate natural areas, do conservation work. A lot of times they don't even, they don't care who shows up. They just need bodies. And once they find out we're communists, they're like, oh, I didn't expect that. But we show up and we double and triple their volunteer efforts, and we can actually get projects done that they would not have labor for otherwise. We're also doing, like Carlos mentioned, a lot of organizing. Chicago is one of the largest port cities. It's a huge hub for the region. And this Teamster work is going to be going national at some point. So we're doing, at this point, a lot of research into the legal status of these drivers, truck drivers. If you don't know, drayage drivers are truck drivers who take containers off of trains or ships, put them on their trucks, and drive them to the last mile. So they take them, they're the ones who deliver all your goods, essentially. It's extremely important for the economy. So we're working on those efforts. We're just trying to find ways we can help, essentially. We're a young party. We're only around about a year now. We're trying to recruit. We're trying to get more people who are interested in doing work like that. So, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess with your last statement, I guess if you become part of the party, I guess if you start saying that you're a young party, so if you join now, you actually get to help shape what the party becomes in the future, right? And that's kind of cool.
One of the founding principles of the party, which, by the way, for those that don't know, the party has In my view, I may be wrong, but the party, I think, is one of the most impressive anti-sectarian efforts that has developed in this century in the US, because it combined a series of different forces on the left who had differences of opinion. Not everyone, for instance, in the executive board agrees on everything. There's fierce debates, and people often come from different parts of how Marxism or Marxism-Leninism is interpreted. But we all share an understanding of the common evils that we have to fight against, and that, you know, theory and the ideas that we have, they're going to be proven correct in practice. They're going to be proven correct through actual material results. So I can already tell you that just in this 1 year, there's been some stuff that we thought was going to work a certain way, and once we find that it doesn't, in, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 months, we change course and we adapt, because the point is not to have this dogmatic veneration for the original texts and the original methods or something like that. That's a way of treating those documents fetishistically, purity fetish, but to actually focus on what is working on the ground, what is winning us people, what is winning us, even if not members, the sympathy of the communities that we're serving. Not a lot of people are willing to join and make the sacrifice that it takes to join a communist party. It's a lot of work. The people in this room that are cadres can tell you it's a lot of work. Now, thankfully, we have a category called reserve that allows you to financially help the party, even if you don't have the time to do so with actual physical works. But you know, winning the sympathy of our people is essential, and we try to see what works in practice. So of course, if you join now and you're a part of the process of trying to figure out what the hell works to get us organized, you're going to play an active role in, I think, the shaping of American history, and that's a pretty fun thing to be a part of.
Thanks for your talk. I'm just wondering. Sure. Thanks for your talk. I'm wondering what ACP's final sort of goals are. I think there's sometimes tension between like the instantiation of national communism as, you know, state-sponsored end project versus the sort of like mutual aid and community organizations that it seems like are the logistical endpoint, furthermost endpoint that I've seen. So can you talk a little bit about ACP's sort of like end goal of instantiating communism nationally?
Well, you know, the thing about end goals, the way that we come to understand communism itself is rooted in the only time that I know of explicitly that Marx or Engels ever said communism is. And it is in a text that was unpublished in their time. It only gets published in 1932 with the Marx-Engels Institute in Moscow, a text called The German Ideology, which some scholars say wasn't actually a book that was intended to be a book, but that's irrelevant. And in this text, there's this phrase where they say, we call communism not an ideal state of affairs that we strive the world to turn into. We call communism the real process of history that overcomes the present state of things. So in many ways, I don't want to get too philosophical here because it's my background. I have an inclination that I always have to resist. In many ways, for us, we understand communism in line with what someone like Hegel would understand world history. It's the process of humanity advancing towards higher forms of social intercourse, of fulfilling that goal of ethical life, the Sittlichkeit, that could be seen present all the way from Greek political philosophy, a community that's based on the flourishing of all, that creates the conditions for the possibility of individuals flourishing in community. So for us, you know, the conception of how communism is going to look in America specifically, it's going to work itself out with time. Like I mentioned, so much of what we do is rooted in American pragmatism. It's rooted in, well, let's see what works. We do, of course, have the ultimate ideals of living in a world without exploitation, without class fracturing humanity, a world where the state itself becomes superfluous and we just have the immediate appropriation by producers. But I think that's a long ways out. A lot has to change before a world like that can come. And for us, what really concerns us is how do we immediately make ourselves agents in the transformations occurring in our country, how do we take responsibility for the American trajectory and play an active role in shaping it toward the better? So I know that's not probably the answer you desired, but I'd be lying if I sat here and gave you a blueprint of how we would conceive of the dialectic between how socialism would work at a national scale and then the local work of mutual communities. In a very general sense, you can't have a state that doesn't accurately represent its people. This is one of the great insights, I think, from Gramsci. You can't just have coercion. You need always consent. And that's true also of socialism. If you have a disconnect between what the federal level wants and what local communities want, you're going to have a failure. What we've seen historically for most socialist states, the successful ones, which I think it's most of them, is this dialectical interplay between satisfying what the local wants and what the national needs. And that's why even in the words themselves, the dialectic between centralism and decentralism, each one implies the other. You know, for there to be a center, there has to be something that is peripheral, and vice versa. So I can't give like a blueprint answer to your question. My apologies.
Yeah. Okay. I just recently read this. You've talked about how philosophy finds a material. Sorry, philosophy. I talk with my hands. Philosophy as a material weapon in the proletariat, and also the proletariat finds its intellectual weapon in philosophy. What does the latter look like for those of us who are I'm like you? I'm an academic refugee. You know. What does the ladder look like?
Yeah, that's one of my favorite quotes. I think it's the quote that we have up on the Midwestern Marx Institute website, which I helped found with my buddy Eddie Smith, who unfortunately couldn't be here 5 years ago. I think it gets back to what I mentioned. Again, I'm going to try to avoid getting jargony, but it gets back to how there's nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come and that grips people. There's many people who have had very similar ideas to Marx and Engels at times where history just wasn't ready for them. And, oh, that's an alarm. It says I got to teach. That's I guess it's right. I don't know. But, you know, how there's this idea that Engels develops in a pamphlet he writes towards the end of his life called Ludwig Feuerbach and the End of Classical German Philosophy, where he ends with this very strange statement that says that the inheritor of the tradition of German philosophy is the German proletariat. I think there's something to the tradition of philosophy that is essentially critical, that situates the aspiration towards what the Greeks called the good as central to what the political community should be striving for and creating the conditions for the possibility of. Every history of philosophy course that I teach, I always start with the Apology of Socrates from Plato, the text where Socrates gets tried in court and eventually condemned to death. Because in that text, I find the spirit of philosophy, which is in many ways the spirit of the revolutionary. There's little difference, in my view, between a figure like Socrates, like Jesus, and like Che Guevara. They're just the same historical archetype at different moments in world history. So, you know, I view, in line again with Marxism, the process of society moving towards communism as the process of us solving the riddle of history. That's a direct quote from Marx. Communism is the riddle of history solved. There's been something from the very beginning where this idea, this aspiration for a community based on rational mutual recognition and creating the conditions for human flourishing, it's been there from the start, it just hasn't been realized. And I think that's what communism strives for, and it can achieve that when the proletariat, the class that in emancipating itself, the working class, not to get jargony, in emancipating itself, it emancipates everyone else. Why? Because it's the class that wears the most burdens. Every burden falls on the proletariat, such that to remove its burdens, it frees everyone else. It wasn't like the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie, the capitalist class, when it had its revolutions, it faced certain burdens from the aristocracy. But once it removed those, what the hell happened to everyone else? Everyone else became even more easily exploitable, right? In liberating itself, it created conditions to exploit everyone else more easily. It brought into existence a system of mute compulsion, where we feel the economic power of capital in ways that are much more nebulous and sinister than the form of exploitation that we saw in the feudal world. So that's how I think of it. Thank you.
Thank you for the talk, comrade. You know, I'm listening to your talk, and especially in the part on national nihilism, my mind couldn't help but wander to the Communist Manifesto, particularly the part which you alluded to, I think, briefly, where in response to the accusation that the working men want to abolish countrymen and nationality, that Marx says the working men have no country, and that the working class has to constitute the nation. So this is, of course, written on the eve of the first wave of revolutions where socialism is really on the table, and it's been about 180 years since then. How do you understand the relationship of what you're presenting as the stakes of an American Marxism with the way that Marx talks about something like that? Or maybe in an easier way, what's the difference between saying why we need American Marxism and why we need Marxism?
American Marxism is just Marxism, right? It's just that, unfortunately, we have one of those traditions that is very textualist in the sense of, you know, really just dogmatist, and it hasn't done the difficult labor of translating Marx into American terms. In other words, of understanding America from the framework of Marxism, of applying the universal theory of class struggle. The history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggles, plural, applying that to see this particular and specific forms it has taken in the American trajectory. So if we had a Marxism that did that, we wouldn't have to talk about American Marxism because it would already implicitly be that. But the fact that we have to bring it up is, I think, evidence of the fact that something is missing. That you know, the call for American Marxism is really a call for like an actual Marxism that isn't just rooted in dogmatically reading Marx and Engels and Lenin and others, but applying that to our situation, recognizing that what makes Marxism Marxism is not the conclusions of Marx, Engels, or Lenin, but the worldview, which is essentially rooted in understanding everything in the world, in nature, in human society, and human thought, as in a process of constantly evolving, rooted in contradictions that are driving that development, interconnected to everything else. You can't have dogmatism with Marxism. They relate to each other like water does to oil. If you have the one, you can't have the other. And because Marxism here has, I don't think, really been Marxism, and my tradition, Marxism-Leninism, has also been at fault in the U.S. If you look at the CPUSA's history, even though it has great thinkers like Henry Winston, Herbert Aptheker, who are all developing, by the way, on Du Bois. None of them developed anything new besides Du Bois. Where were they getting their understanding of America from? It was just coming from Moscow. And I'm not, you know, I don't condemn the Soviet Union. I'm supportive of the Soviet Union. But one of the big mistakes was the fact that it wasn't able to be faithful enough to how it understood the process of socialist construction itself. It wasn't able to give these countries the ability to analyze their own conditions and do for their countries what the Soviets did for theirs, right? So we need American Marxism simply because just saying Marxism hasn't been enough. We need to emphasize the fact that we need real Marxism, you know, analyzing the specific character of our conditions through the Marxist framework. The point where I thought you were going when you brought up, you know, the temporal. Oh my God, nobody saw it. You're good. The camera's facing me. No one cares. I saw someone tweak the chair before as well, so it's not on you. You didn't get to spear. As long as you didn't spill the beer, you're good. That's the benefit of drinking it. But where I thought you were going was the question of the nation itself, because the truth is that historically, the concept of nation itself is a product of capitalism. It's a product of the fact that capitalism needed to institutionalize a way of connecting people to a common market, of making disparate communities, bringing them under the same umbrella, providing a common language, framework of institutions, etc. And there's a lot of scholarship that suggests that, thinking in terms of nations is a double-edged sword, because it could potentially promote certain forms of tribalism, which I think are unhelpful. I personally, and don't let this get outside of this room, I think that we're heading towards a context where civilizational thinking is perhaps going to be a little bit more important than the Wilsonian notion of nations. In fact, our party is kind of implementing that in the way that it thinks about America as a civilization, as a project that includes Canada. It's not just America. We see Canada, what happened in Canada, as an unfinished revolution against the British Empire. And any revolution, I think, that happens in America also has to ask itself the question, what about our brothers up north who were not successful in their fight against the Brits? No offense to the comrade here from London that's somewhere back there. So yeah, I know it's, I think I addressed your question and then invented a question from your question to answer as well. Anyone else?
Yes. Hello, everyone. My name is Kelvin. I have two questions, actually. The first one is, I think I understand how you presented communism, more like an horizontal thing, like a vision for organizing in many ways. But I wonder, why is the entitled thing with private property? Because what I understanding is the big idea is like there is no liberation as long as there is a society created and organized around private property. And that's in the core of Marx thinking, I believe. So I want to know if you can elaborate that more, because when I think in organizing for communism, it's organizing against private property, which I agree. And the second question is maybe more difficult. It's, you mentioned the word fetishism many times, but you haven't defined it. And I know it's very difficult to define what Marx understands by fetishism, but I would like to know, what do you think about that?
Okay. Those are very good and dense questions. The first one, which was, remind me again the first?
Private property.
Private property, okay,
Private
good.
property.
Marx talks about private property in different senses, right? If you look even at the end of the first volume of Capital, he says that capital is private property supplanted a form of life that also had as dominant private property, but a different type of private property, what he calls self-earned private property, which is the private property that bourgeois political philosophy speculates its states of nature and the transition towards formal governance, commonwealths, even though there wasn't much common, on the basis of. So when we're speaking about private property, especially in the immediate terms of struggling for the first stage of socialism, for a dictatorship of the proletariat, we have to remember, I think, this distinction, and mine, especially since Americans like their small businesses. I like small businesses that give character to communities, so that we don't just have a bunch of Walmarts in every place, or Walmarts ran by the state or something like that. We have to remember this distinction. I think that there could be an advanced socialism, although perhaps not a communist society, with a domain of sovereignty for that type of self-earned private property, the mom and pop shops. Now, in terms of big monopoly capital, I'm going to answer it focusing on, I think, the immediate lowest level of socialism, of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Marx and Engels are clear in the manifesto that the property of the capitalist class is going to be wrested by degrees. That's a direct verbatim quote, wrested by degrees. What does this mean? That insofar, after the working class conquers political power, insofar as capitalist private property can still develop the productive forces, you can regulate it, you can control it to some extent, but you don't have to expropriate it completely. This, of course, is perhaps in contradiction with the quote, the death knell asunder, the expropriators are expropriated from the end of capital, but I digress. The point is that in terms of even large-scale private property, the question is going to be, can it be utilized, instrumentalized, as I think China has done, in a way that, at least in the immediate term, promotes the common good and uplifts the living standard of people, develops the productive forces, technologies of society, so that it gives us free time, because that's ultimately what we want, free time, to not have to work slavishly for 10 hours a day. So the question of property, I think, for communism is central in a certain sense. I think for socialism, the question becomes one of what Mao called political capital. He made a very important distinction between economic and political capital. And he said that in the earliest stages of socialism, the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is a scary word for Americans, but all it means is democracy, because democracy is demos, common people, kratos, the ability to rule, exert power over. Dictatorship of the proletariat just means the ability for common people, working people, to exert power over their lives, to have actual autonomy and sovereignty. But Mao said that in the dictatorship of the proletariat, insofar as capitalism helps us develop, we keep it there, but we do not let them touch any amount of political capital. To use a phrase from Che Guevara, we don't allow imperialism to come in ni tantito así, not even this much we allow it to come in. We can't allow the bourgeoisie to have any access to political power. I think that's fundamental. The way that I read the collapse of the Soviet Union is that it already had a lot of issues, but it really starts its downward turn when it allows foreign imperialist forces to have political influence in their country, to obtain a form of political capital. So ideally, in the ideal communist society, which is not the realm in which I'm usually thinking of, there's no private property. In the immediate sense of the construction of socialism in its earliest stages, it's about ensuring that even if there is big capitalist private property, it's controlled by the people's government. It ensures that it works at least towards the common good and doesn't turn into the speculative, parasitic capital that we have today. Because that's another point that is also important to make. Marx already developed in the third volume of Capital the conception that that formula, which a lot of us know from the beginning of Capital Volume 1, MCM prime, right, of turning money, the commodity, and then more money from that, that cycle of productive capital tends more and more towards M to M prime, towards accumulation through interest-bearing capital. That's what we have in the US. Most profits are made from rents, from interest, and from speculative financialized means. In China, that's not how capital operates. They still have productive capital, and that productive capital is forced to work as an auxiliary part, that means an aid of the centrally planned state economy. It's forced to work for the ends of the state. And when it doesn't, we see Chinese humanism at play. When capitalists start getting out of hand, they get whacked. So we can debate how humane that is. Maybe we throw them in a gulag to re-educate them or something. That's Soviet humanism. But I think realistically, that's how socialism will look like in the beginning stages in terms of the question of private property. I don't know if that helps, but the second, you also had a second question. About fetishism. To not get into an extremely jargony discussion, fetishism is this process whereby something is hidden, right? And it appears as something else. And the basic development that Marx outlines of how the commodity fetishism operates, it is a process through which what is actually relations between people ends up appearing as relations between things. We go to the market and we act like the thing in front of us has a specific value in itself without realizing that that value is relational in character. It's a social product. So that's really the essence of fetishism. And when we talk about the purity fetish, and for instance how the purity fetish looks with how some leftists analyze actually existing socialist states, it's the same thing. It's about divorcing, hiding a real concrete reality by putting in front of it this vague abstract ideal of what it has to look like in order to be the thing. it's fetishistic in that sense, in the sense that it ignores, it hides, it obscures real social relations upon which what is being observed is premised.
Maybe we have time for a couple more questions, if you wouldn't mind. And I'm going to ask one, if that's okay. Just because Ed promised a controversial talk, and as a Marxist, I don't think too much of this is controversial. I want to talk about one of the points that I feel like I've come up against with people who like recognize things falling apart, and my like impulse to talk in a maybe what you'd characterize as a nihilistic way about how awful the empire is. Like this idea that if just Trump went away, then MAGA, we'd be back to rah-rah US Bidenism or something, right? Like that ends up being a wall with some people, like, oh, you don't see anything right with the US? And I wonder like about sort of the perhaps differently used pragmatic character of that tactic, whether not questioning its authenticity, but asking for you to analyze the it being an efficacious thing to draw more people into Marxism, to say like, no, we don't have to throw out these patriotisms that you're indoctrinated into, like the necessity of that for a bigger tent or something, like, and then like the controversy of us hosting you here came from the things that you kind of read as a throwaway, these like tweets or whatever, right? Like, and in like trying to assess that as people were asking like, why would you ever host them, da 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 da. Right, it seems like you can talk about it being one of the founding members who has some maybe anti-identitarian ideas and specifically has spoken to trans topics. And that just, and then having read just a little bit about like, a characterization of like cultural conservatism and materialist Marxist revolutionary thought, right? And that admixture. And I wonder if consciously or otherwise that also may be read as something pragmatic. If you're talking about being able to engage with MAGA folks or something, if not conceding but not engaging on points of culture war is something that feels like, oh, like because the revolution, then maybe we don't engage on those points, or we bigger tent that. And it just rhymes a little bit with the way that it's easy to oppress trans folks because they don't have a large enough voice. And that then becomes a potential problem with democracy in general, right? And so that giant bundle of questions is what I want to put in your...
Yeah, thank you. For the first question, I think we have to make an important distinction that's already made by Michael Parenti between patriotism, actually loving your people and wanting what's best for them, and sacrificing the utmost thing we can sacrifice, even our life, to fight for a better world for them, which doesn't exclude also, loving people from around the world. It's just that this is the country we grew up in. And super patriotism, which is the attitude of my country is always right, even when it's wrong. It's the pro-war, hoorah, wave the American flags, fly the military planes, and do the fireworks thing. I think that's a very essential distinction, and I think that super patriotism is not patriotic at all because it doesn't give a damn about the American people. It doesn't give a damn about the American people. In fact, it thrives off of pushing the American people into more difficult circumstances in terms of their life. It doesn't care about American traditions. You think that super patriotism gives a shit about Thomas Paine and the real Martin Luther King Jr., not the caricature that they give us of him. It doesn't care about American lands. It wants to privatize those. It doesn't want those to be available to the public. It doesn't want American lands to be available for Americans. And it has the audacity to call itself often America First. I think as most of us in this room know, it's usually another country that's first for them. So I think that distinction is important. Now, as far as the MAGA base, I think, in line with my comrade and brother, Hazal Din, the chairman of the party, that there's a vector of radicalization ongoing in American society. People are dissenting to the system. They don't agree with the status quo, but they have no fucking clue of where to go. And what's happening to MAGA could turn scary, because I think MAGA's being delinked from Trump. It got delinked when Trump bombed Iran, and then continued to get delinked now with the whole Epstein files thing, the self-disappearing files. And the question is, where are these people going to go? And you open any application on our phones from Instagram to X, and all you see is a bunch of Nazi bullshit. You see Hitler being promoted as the cool guy that fought against the system, and communism and Stalin and the Soviet Union, they were just backed up by the same Jews that are backing up the current state of affairs. And it's mind-blowingly stupid and factually inaccurate, but it's presented in such an aestheticized form that people who have nowhere else to go, no explanation for what the hell has happened to their life, and no imagination to think about something else, or even the means through which to do that thinking, it's winning a lot of them over. We can get into, the role of learning how to wage the war of positions, as Gramsci called it, in the age of prolificity, in the age of digital media. How do we meme better? How do we engage in that discourse in such a way that we attract people at not just a rational, but also an intuitive level, which is where memes operate. So I think you have a vector of radicalization right now, and that MAGA base, it could go either route. I think most of them are 1,000,000 times more primed to turn towards communism. In my time organizing with Bernie as an undergrad, the socialist labor club that we had in our campus, I would say 90% of the people that joined it came from MAGA. They were working class and farmer background who supported Trump because they thought he was a political outsider. I think those people are much more primed for radicalization than someone who just dislikes Trump because they dislike Trump and want to go back to the status quo of the Clintonites and the neoliberal Democratic Party establishment. The other question, right, which is the fun one, the question of the social morality that communists have, which I think, I may be wrong, but it's my opinion, I think that's what a lot of this comes down to. How is it that you're going to think about gay or trans issues, etc.? The historical fact is that most communist societies of the past, and some of the most influential ones of the present, have been historically what in the American political spectrum we have called conservative. They have prioritized family values. They haven't always been the most friendly to gay communities. And for the most part, there wasn't even a trans question for many of them. Does that in itself disclassify them as socialists? Does that mean that they have to be condemned? I think the answer is no. Are we ready to condemn the Sandinistas in Nicaragua just because the fact that they're Catholic socialists means that they stand against abortion? I'm not ready to do that. I will never do that. Now, if women's struggles in Nicaragua are being waged in a way that's compatible with the government and fighting for abortion rights, that's something we can support. But I'm never going to make myself a puppet of attacks on these countries that are facing a fierce siege by U.S. imperialism. There goes the alarm again. I teach at 8. That's the thing, guys. I'm never going to make my puppet of a left campaign of delegitimizing these socialist states because they have a different social morality. And I think that in the same way that those countries had different social mores and morality, our working class does as well. I think a significant chunk of the American working class considers itself more so conservative on a lot of these questions. That's the experience that I have found in the Midwest. That's definitely the experience that I have found in my time living in Texas. And that's the experience that I found growing up in Miami, where just to tell you the atmosphere I grew up with, I came to know 5 white Americans by the time I left Miami. It was I primarily grew up with Cubans, Hispanic people, and black people. I hadn't met any white people until I got to Iowa. It was when I got to Iowa to study that I heard what a pronoun was, So that's how conservative that part of society was. And those people cannot be canceled or condemned or considered unorganizable because they don't agree with someone else. The policy that our party currently has, which is, I think, what we should be judged by, not a tweet or another from someone in the party. The policy that our party has is respect. You know, respect people, respect their difference. Don't denigrate someone, because that's a basic human question. It's not even the trans question or gay. It's a basic human question. Don't be an asshole, basically. Our party has people that are trans. Our party has people that are gay. some of which are in the room. There you go. It's not a problem, you know. We engage with each other, and if people have differences, they have differences, but we don't let that get to antagonisms. And if it ever begins to fester into antagonism, the point of party leadership is to step in and say, calm down. You know, we've had issues like that. You know, we had a debate some months ago between Catholics and Protestants in the party that we had to, all right, calm down, guys, you know, keep this in the intellectual realm. But that's a position of our party. We don't impose conservative ideas on members or anything like that. And I think it's important to recognize, guys, that anybody trying to do what we're doing, which is literally just fight against the system, unite people on the basis of what we share, extremely non-sectarian in that sense, and base itself on results such that we can change course very quickly if we see something's not working. Any organization that arises that's like that, that's also, you know, no offense to the older comrades here, led by young people that understand the age of digital media, that can do memes, that can do TikToks, that can post tweets that go viral. Any organization that has that capability is going to be attacked. And they're always going to find one thing or another to attack it for, some of it based on half facts, others based on things torn out of context, and others based on complete fabrications. There's been tweets that have shaped the understanding that people have of someone like my friend and comrade Jackson Hinkle that he never tweeted out, that have literally just been faked, but they've gone viral because it's popular for these people that are a part of the old institutional left that I don't think was able to accomplish much, even though there was objectively revolutionary conditions in our country and have been for a very long time. It's popular to defame. And the funny thing about rumors is that they don't have to be true to work. It wasn't true that Socrates was corrupting the youth, and you know, but it was rumors, you know, and it worked, and it got him killed. There's a good book by a Slovenian philosopher, part of the big three, not Wade and Bosch and LeBron, but the big three of psychoanalysis in Slovenia, Zizek, Alenka Zupančič, and Mladen Dolar. There's a recent book by Mladen Dolar on rumors and how they work and how they're almost the anti-philosophy medium of discourse. And that's the sphere where a lot of the attacks against the ACP come from. They don't come from actual facts, from things in our program, from experiences that people have when they're in the party. They come a lot of the time from rumors and from things taken from a context where the people that are in leadership now didn't have the responsibility in terms of what they post on social media that they would have when they become a member of an organization like the ACP.
Hi, thank you so much for that talk, Carlos. I appreciate you taking audience questions. I got to take a look at one of the flyers from your party up there at the front, and I saw that you guys have a party program, and I've never seen anything like that before. Front and center, canceling all debt. I can't think of any other political party in the country that has that as part of their platform. So could you tell us just a little bit more about what is the party program of the American Communist Party?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Any Christians in here? A few Christians back there. Not many, man. That's strange. The phrase, may they be forgiven for their sins. Do we know what sins used to mean back in the day? It used to mean debt, right? So that first policy on our party's platform is in many ways a policy that any Christian in this country should support, because it's quite literally doing what Jesus said, abolish the debt. Most of the party platform is rooted in, I think, a program that's pretty sensible if people actually read it and engage with it. Reindustrialize America. Today, the American economy is completely rooted in fictitious capital, that interest-bearing capital that I told you that Marx spoke about in Volume 3. We have crumbling cities. I mean, I'm going across Chicago. I'm seeing stuff that's defying the laws of physics. I'm seeing railroad tracks that somehow have rusted every single column, and it still stands. It's maybe like that cat that hasn't found out yet, and might collapse soon. But reindustrialize America. This can be done in a green form, in a form that's in line with ecological, civilizational paradigms like China's promoting. Cancel the debt, guarantee basic social and economic rights that we're supposed to have according to the United Nations Charter on social and economic and cultural rights, things like education, guaranteed health care, a national health system. Of course, the Medicare for All policy was always a half measure. Stuff like that. Stuff that I think for a lot of people is going to resemble the platform that people appreciated in Bernie Sanders, except it goes perhaps a little further in some areas, and it puts that platform in the context of an organization that actually wants to fight for it, not one that wants to just take people's donations and give it back to the establishment Democrats after they were fooled into supporting what they thought was a political revolution. But not all of the points are coming to mind, guys, so feel free to check out the actual literature that we have over there on the party's program. It's going to do a much better job than I have at explaining all these points, because it's like 18 or something of them. It's quite a few.
As a gay member of the party, I'd like to ask about the national question, which, as you pointed out, I think really well, is a class question, right? I wondered if you could just speak a little bit to this sort of complex of ideologies and analyses that often get categorized as the settlers' thesis, or third worldism, or decolonial Marxism. And this idea that, I think you've made the point that there's an element of American exceptionalism or inverse American exceptionalism there, that the idea is, in some cases, I don't want to, improperly classify other people's ideologies, but the idea that the American nation or the USA is this kind of anti-nation, is this special case, and in the age of imperialism in particular, constitutes this kind of bourgeois nation as a whole, and can't really be thought of in the same way, can't have a revolution in the same way as other national realities. Could you speak a little bit to that? For example, you hear people say that a majority of Americans are homeowners, so how could they be the proletariat? How could you organize people like that? It's not just an ideological question. I think there are interesting sort of material questions involved. And if you could just speak a little bit on that, that would be awesome. Thank you.
Well, as far as the last point, the majority of Americans are not homeowners, right? Because most homes are owned by the banks, by finance capital. The majority of Chinese are homeowners, even though they're communists and hate private property, right? The majority of Cubans are homeowners, even though they're communists and hate private property. The question of the settlers' thesis is very, very new. I know a large chunk of the left likes to pretend like it's old and just standard, and who wouldn't agree that America is a settler colony that must be abolished and balkanized? It's an extremely new phenomenon. It gets intensified with some mainstream projects from the liberal part of the ruling capitalist class, but there's an interesting transition that happens when Herbert Aptheker, which was basically the authoritative communist historian, in the beginning of this century, there's this strange story that I still don't know all the details of, but I've asked a few of the old heads in the party about. And there was this event that happened with his daughter, who remembered at a very late age, supposedly, that her father molested her. And the context in which it was situated in was extremely strange. It was, everyone in the family said, this doesn't make any sense. There was no really basis for it. It was rooted in a memory that came to her, I believe, in a dream or something like that. But anyways, when this happens, Herbert Aptheker gets thrown out. The guy that said that the American Revolution was the first anti-colonial revolution in the hemisphere. The guy that considered socialism as the logical and practical conclusion of the progressive parts of the ideals of 1776. And a new historian gets his place as the authoritative one in U.S. history. And that's Gerald Horne, who's the one that promotes the thesis that the American Revolution was actually a counter-revolution. This leads to interesting questions. It was a counter-revolution against what? Because the British did not want to abolish slavery. For Christ's sake, during the American Civil War, it wasn't until the First International, led by Karl Marx, that the British decided to not intervene in favor of the Confederacy, because the working class in Britain was ready to fight back and have even a revolution if the British intervened. So how can a country in 1865 want to continue defending a slave system, but they were the ones in 1775 and 6 that were trying to abolish it? That doesn't make much sense. So he develops this thesis of America as a counter-revolution, which inherently classifies the American working class as settlers. And I think really that's where the historical revisionism in part starts. It also starts with this figure, J. Sakai, an anonymous author. Not many people know much about him. There's very credible evidence that he was tied to U.S. intelligence, and that the purpose of which was to balkanize the left, as imperialism always tries to do, separate people who have fundamentally more in common with each other. And the reality is that any form of American socialism is going to have to, of course, make do on the promises that were given to indigenous communities, include them, as Bolivia has done, which you know very well, as a part of having a sense of autonomy over how their communities are governed, and integrate them into the general national framework. Most indigenous people consider themselves Americans. The largest institutions that indigenous people have, it's called the American Indian Movement. There's a recognition that they're American. So this thesis that the white working class are just settlers, and it, not to offend anyone, but it comes from middle class white academics. It's not coming from indigenous communities. It's coming from that sector. And to go back to the Horn thesis, which has grown extremely popular in the left, it's one of the main foundations for the national nihilism that has affected explicitly communists, or people that call themselves communists. We made a post on the Institute a few days ago about this. One of the central components of the logic of Trotskyism, which, I don't know if there's any Trotskyites out there, no hate against you, but it's not the tradition that I'm a part of. One of the central components of Trotskyism has always been a neither-sidism, an attempt to be neutral on a moving train, as Howard Zinn used to say. It's the logic of neither Moscow nor Washington, or neither Moscow, or neither Washington nor Beijing today would be the equivalent. Isn't it interesting that, this individual, Gerald Horn, who wouldn't consider himself a Trotskyite, who says he likes Stalin, sides with Stalin, nonetheless, when he proposes this thesis of the counter-revolution, operates under the same logic. Because he's not ready to say, no, the British Empire were progressive. But if you say that the people fighting against the British Empire, at a moment where the world was literally divided, where you were either in favor of this anti-colonial revolution or with the empire, if you say, no, the anti-colonial revolution wasn't actually a revolution, it was a counter-revolution, and then you say, no, but I'm not, that doesn't mean I'm in favor of the British Empire. That's what Trotskyites have always done. Moscow is shit, we have to overthrow the Soviet Union, but I'm not in favor of US imperialism. China's an authoritarian hellhole, we have to overthrow it. We have to balkanize it. But I'm not in favor of US imperialism. Well, the way you speak about them sure as hell sounds like what the US State Department says. This is the same thing, just applied to 1776. So, yeah, I don't know if that helps to answer it.
No, that's great. I just want to throw one last at you, which is it a problem that Americans are richer on average than the rest of the world? Does that make less right for revolution? Does that mean there can't be a revolution here? And
I know you had to teach things, so can we get one more question in response?
Yes, of course. It's interesting.
Take the one more question in response.
We're richer relative to other countries, but we have very unique ills that other countries, I think, don't face, primarily of which is debt, something most Americans are under for the crimes of either getting sick or wanting an education or wanting a home. that means if you really calculate debt into the equation and you understand that anywhere from 60 to 80% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck, not only is such a thing like wealth used to describe Americans, kind of a ridiculous category, but it's almost an anti-wealth. We have negative dollars because of how much goddamn debt we're all in. Other countries are poor. Cuba, for instance, is very poor because of the blockade. But none of the Cubans I've met have to deal with debt. That's a constant stress that wears you down. Cubans are poor, but at the end of the week, they can go to a club, very affordable, have a few bottles of rum with their buddies, and live on average 3 years more than the Americans, perhaps because of that stress of debt. So technically richer, but are we really? You know? I don't know if that helps. But.
Hi. Thus far, you've described a lot of amazing humanist ideas and a focus on social justice and social welfare. In America currently, 30% of plants and 40% of animals are estimated to become extinct in the next 15 years. What motivation does the American Communist Party have for ecological restoration and care for the environment, if any?
Well, I can answer that through our deeds. Today we spent most of our morning, and some of our comrades from 9 o'clock in the morning. I got there a little later because I had trouble sleeping. Up until, what was it, Slava? 1 o'clock or something? Precisely doing what you're mentioning, removing invasive species that harm plants and accelerate this process of certain plants or animals going extinct in that park. So there's not a very specific party platform point that addresses these questions, but we consider, that the part of America is not just the people, it's the environment that is conjoined with it, the environment that people live in. So we wouldn't ever want to promote the sort of policies that accelerate the process of destroying that environment. As Xi Jinping often says, we don't want to have growth that sacrifices lush rivers and something mountains. He has another. So our position is the same. We would of course be in favor of conserving natural habitats and species and all that stuff. So it's not explicitly written into the program, but ideally when we grab power, there'd be a whole ministry dealing with that. So.
Okay, I know you said you had to go teach, so thank you very much.
No, I don't.
Thanks everyone for coming. And then just a little housekeeping, please come back. We have 9 more days of programming. Tomorrow, first thing, is maybe the best thing, a history of counterinsurgency in Latin America. At noon, get here, there'll be water and drinks. But then also Chema Skandal, doing print intervention posters. We'll do more wheat pasting, scenes of the revolution. Sobre las Hojas is a Spanish language program, another free barbecue. And then we'll end with a history of leftist video and film media, a screening at 7. So thanks, come back, hang out. Thanks for coming.